In this video, I'll do a quick recap from the first episode of my own take on a Second Age show, aka what the Rings of Power should have been. So if you want a more detailed version of this first episode, feel free to watch that video afterwards. There's a link in the pinned comment below. And welcome back, friends and foes of Middle-earth. Before we begin, I want to mention that this recap is not how future episodes will be like. Future episodes will be explained in a more chronological order and with less exposition on my part. In this recap, I'll go a little off topic a couple of times to explain certain aspects and also as a way to respond to some of the wonderful feedback you guys have left on the first episode. We're just going to go through this episode in a chronological order, so we will start with the prologue. The prologue is actually meant to be Elrond explaining the early lore of the world, but we will get back to that as it actually fits a certain scene in the episode. If you've ever read the Silmarillion, you might recognize some of the stuff mentioned in the prologue, perhaps even some of the lines here and there. The whole purpose of the prologue was to give an idea what happened before the Second Age and what's the main conflict of this show. We learned that the world was created in the Song of Ainur Lindale and that Eru seems to be above the Ainur. I think it's fine it's rather vague who and what Eru is, as that's something that will come up a few times through the seasons. The important part is that one of the Ainur, Melkor, was making trouble. We hear that he creates foul beings, which is obviously the orcs that appear on screen, but also dragons, and then that he allies other beings, which is both Ungoliant, that will come up again later in the episode, but also the Balrogs, something both shown in the prologue and mentioned briefly in the episode as well. So the antagonist of this show isn't Morgoth himself, but rather his servants that survived and fled after the War of Wrath. Now the first that comes to mind is Sauron, but it's actually not a red herring that I've phrased it like this. Sauron will not be the only antagonist in this show, so expect the elves and Numenorians to search and hunt for the remnant armies of Morgoth. That's the main conflict, but also an external one. If you're into storytelling, you know that most characters have an internal conflict as well as an external conflict, which we will uncover both in this episode and the coming ones. The prologue ends with a brief history of Numenor up till 725, where the episode starts out. We hear Elros, half-elven, was the first king of Numenor and that he founded the kingdom. Let's go from the prologue to the actual scenes. There are 19 scenes in this episode, and I think lengthwise it seems to fit well with the 1 hour each episode was meant to be, if it had been turned into an actual TV series. As I explained at the end of episode 1, the future episodes will not be told scene by scene, so not a script, but much more like this, where I go through what is meant to happen in each episode. So let's dive into scene 1. We start out on the ship Numenor with Prince Aldarion and his grandfather Fëanor, captain of the king's ships. We learn that Aldarion has never been to Middle-earth and is very eager to go there. Only once before have the Numenorians visited Middle-earth since the founding of the kingdom. That happened 125 years before the start of this episode, and it was Fëanor that led the expedition there. In the second scene, I've used some actual dialogue from Fëanor, which you can read in the Unfinished Tales, Aldarion and Erindis, the mariner's wife. Fëanor sees in Aldarion parts of himself, a young, ambitious man that wants to sail and explore the world. On one hand, he wants to give in and fulfill his unfulfilled dreams with Aldarion, but at the same time he is hesitant as norms and traditions bind him to the island of Numenor. He knows his time as captain is near its end, and that is what ultimately makes him want to go back to Middle-earth. One last adventure before he's too old. Fëanor knows, however, that Aldarion's father is not happy about Aldarion's voyages, so he tells him to go speak to him. In scene 3, Aldarion rides to the northern end of the island to his father's tower, which in the lore is simply known as Meneldur's Tower. It becomes clear that Aldarion and his father have some very different views on the world. His father Meneldur wants Aldarion to take responsibility and do his duty as the future heir of the kingdom. He needs to stay on Numenor and learn what the previous kings have been taught. There is no time for playing around. He needs to appear and behave like a future king. Aldarion, on the other hand, is far more adventurous and wants to explore and learn about the world outside of Numenor. He knows that many things wait outside of Numenor, but doesn't have an idea how much yet. Elmarian, his mother, comes in and defends his adventurous side, and convinces Meneldur that it's just a phase in his life since he is young. She knows that Aldarion is not so different than her own father. Still, Meneldur is displeased with Aldarion's desire to sail all the time, but give in for this one voyage to the Grey Havens. In the fourth scene, we are in Amenelos, the capital of Numenor, and King Tar Elendil, fourth king of Numenor, is speaking to Aldarion, his grandson. Tar Elendil is quite the lore master, and I've just finished a detailed map of Numenor he shows to Aldarion. As a viewer, we have a brief chance to get an idea what sort of island they are living on. Next, Tar Elendil picks up a sword on display. It's Arandaruth, the sword of the kings of Numenor. Tar Elendil reveals that it once belonged to the elven king Thingol of Doriath. So it's an elven sword, which was prized by the king, but no one on Numenor has ever used it in combat and are unaware of its powers. Aldarion questions the line of succession and why his father is the heir and not his aunt Silmarion, that is the oldest child of Tar Elendil. Lore-wise, there's also another sister named Isilme, but she's not really important to the narrative and might not be mentioned again. Tar Elendil tries to explain the traditions of Numenor to Aldarion and how only males inherit the scepter of Numenor, the symbol of the king. That might seem like a minor detail, but it's quite a big deal lore-wise. And we're not bound to the more classical elements like crowns and thrones. Tar Elendil reveals that Silmarion didn't get nothing. She got another sword, a scepter of silver, and a ring. You might have missed this line, but note it down, because it will actually play a key role throughout the entire show. Tar Elendil grants his blessing to Aldarion, but hands him a book before he leaves. Lore-wise, we know Aldarion wrote down about his voyages, and I decided to connect that with some lore about Tar Elendil. It's known he made many books from the legends and lore gathered by his grandfather, Vardamir Nolimon, the son of Elros and second king of Numenor, though he never actually ruled but passed on the scepter to Tar Amandil. Still, Nolimon is written down as the second ruler of Numenor, and was also mentioned briefly in regards to the map Tar Elendil created. Tar Elendil is also called Parmaite, which is Quenya and means book-handed or book in hand. So just another little detail that seems to fit well with Aldarion. Next thing we are at Romena, and Almarion hands a bow of Oyolaire to her father Vientur. It's a Numenorian tradition we know from the lore. It's a tiny detail you might have missed, but it will be brought up again, and we will also see what happens if you set sail without the bow. Vientur gives command to set sail, and we are introduced to 3 companions on board the ship: Voronwe, Ulba, and Hendag. The latter 2 are from the mariner's wife, and Voronwe is inspired by the seafaring elf of the same name. These will be the friends of Aldarion in Season 1 and go with him through his adventures. They aren't the most important characters, but they will play an interesting role in certain scenes down the line. Numenor sinks into the horizon as Vientur and Aldarion look back. This tiny little scene is based on what Tolkien wrote as well. Now it is a bit problematic. The last thing they see is the top of Middle Tama. As the world is supposed to be flat at this point, you can probably see the problem here. I decided to include it despite the inconsistency with that bit of lore. I felt it was important to stay true to Tolkien's vision of that particular scene. Vientur reflects on his last voyage to Middle-earth, though it's not described in great detail. I wouldn't say it's that important for the story, but there are 2 things I want to highlight from it. That he went to the Tower Hills, like Aldarion does later in this episode, and that there are Edain living in Eriador, though essentially they're kin, but not blessed with the long life of the Numenorians. This is important for a number of reasons. First, we learn that the Numenorians live longer, which is quite an important aspect of their life, also in this first season, and it means there are potential allies to find in Eriador. Though Vientur also warns Aldarion about men not being elf friends, and men that do not wish to befriend the Numenorians. This is of course foreshadowing of what is coming, and if you know anything about the Numenorians and the colonization of Middle-earth, then you know it wasn't all quiet and peaceful. So expect to see lots of different kinds of men and how the Numenorians interacted with them. In regards to that, I want to highlight a little hidden gem of lore you probably missed here. Aldarion points out they haven't brought weapons with them. This is actually from the lore that they only brought bows and axes with them during their early explorations in Middle-earth. So the Numenorians aren't warriors in any way at this point, but you can probably guess that will change at some point. It is also something that is pointed out a few times later in this episode, in case you missed that. As the ship Numerama sails towards Middle-earth, we get a montage of the ship going through different types of weather, and day and night of course. I think it's very important to highlight the distance between certain locations, and I must say, it's something that was completely butchered in the Rings of Power over and over again. It's such an important aspect in any fantasy series, as well as communication. I think we modern people take it for granted how easy it is to get access to certain information, and how fast and easily we can communicate with each other and cover large distances. If the people in Middle-earth could do that, it would be a completely different story. And something like The Lord of the Rings would just be kind of a joke, really. It's important to show that everything is not right next to each other. But let's move on. As the ship approaches Middle-earth, the crew rush to the front of the ship, and Ventur whispers, Ered Luin. In case you don't know, that is the Sindarin name for the Blue Mountains, that has both a northern and southern end in the Second Age. I did think a lot about this specific scene. As I mentioned, the world is flat, so in theory, you could see all of it at the same time. It wouldn't be the top of the mountains you would see first. But at the same time, there are limits to how far humans can see. So even if it is a flat world, I think a mountain chain like the Blue Mountains would still be seen before the grassland at its feet. So I think that's how the scene should look. So not the top of the mountains, but rather all of it slowly becoming more clear, almost as if it had been hidden by a thin veil of fog. It's a minor thing, but many have been asking about the world and if it's flat or round. So again, it is flat, and I'll point it out one more time in one of the last scenes. As they arrive in Grey Havens, Círdan the shipwright greets them at the docks. It becomes clear that he was expecting their arrival. He mentions that he has the gift of foresight, but some might consider it a curse. It's a bit of a wordplay, as Tolkien often describes foresight as a gift. At the same time, we the audience haven't exactly heard all that Círdan had foreseen, and there's a little hint to this in the dialogue with Gil-galad, but we will get back to that in a minute. There's a bit of friendly dialogue between Círdan, Aldarion and Ventur. It should be clear that the elves welcome the Numenorians with open arms and consider them as friends. This might have seemed a little unusual if you don't know the lore very well, but I hope to highlight the connection between the Numenorians and the elves in future episodes. Círdan escorts the Numenorians to the throne room of Gil-galad. On the way, I added a minor detail about how Ulbar eyes one of the elf maidens, and then Voronoi slaps him in the back of the head. Of course, he's captured by her beauty, and it's a tiny setup for a payoff we will see in episode 2. I don't really want to spoil it here, but if you're hardcore lore buff, you might guess what it is. Círdan leads them to the halls, and Gil-galad greets them. Present in the background is also the elves Pengoloth and Galdor. Pengoloth is known as one of the greatest lore masters of the elves, and that's also his role at Gil-galad's court. Galdor is simply one of the subjects of Gil-galad, and it's a bit of a cameo that he's here. In The Lord of the Rings, Círdan doesn't go to the Council of Elrond. Instead, he sends an elf on his behalf, and that elf is Galdor, so I thought it would be nice to include him here. He will play some tiny role in later seasons, but it's not really a character you need to remember. It's just a bit of fan service to lore nerds. Gil-galad welcomes the Numenorians and is happy to see Ventur return. He is surprised to see him return so soon, as he says. But what he fails to realize is that 125 years have passed. So it's a hint to the fact that elves are immortal, and the way they experience time is very different from how men and other races experience it. When Gil-galad sees Aldarion for the first time, his first expression is, "So it is true." Círdan had foreseen a certain Numenorian would arrive in Grey Havens, but there is actually another vision of Círdan that haven't been revealed to the audience yet. But that is why Gil-galad also has some fears about the Numenorians, and why this is the first thing he replies. Círdan even confirms this with a little nod he gives to Gil-galad. Gil-galad probably knew Círdan was right about his foresight, but hoped it would prove untrue. So there is a secret here that will be revealed in later episodes. Gil-galad mentions that he wants to hold a grand feast for the Numenorians, but it will first be tomorrow as he has other matters to attend. And that is one of the regular council meetings with the lords and ladies of Lindon. Gil-galad calls over Galdor to escort Ventur and the mariners to their chambers, while Círdan escorts Aldarion to meet Elrond the Half-Elven. And the next scene is Círdan and Aldarion on the way to Elrond's home in Lindon. On the way, Círdan can seem a little proud, boasting himself as the greatest shipbuilder alive. It wasn't exactly intentional, but it is still true, even if it can sound a little self-aggrandizing. It's important to establish Círdan as the most knowledgeable about ships and shipbuilding, as it will become one of the main reasons why Aldarion continues to travel to Middle-earth. As he explains to Círdan, it is of great interest to him. We also get some history about how the Numenorians got to Numenor, From the prologue, we just heard that the men that aided the elves were given an island, but it wasn't explained how they got to the island. The answer is Círdan, whose ships brought them from Middle-earth to Numenor. Not in one go, however. Ventur actually also mentions in a previous scene that his great-grandfather sailed with Elros to Numenor. The scene then shifts to the council meeting with Gil-galad and his subjects. Present at the council is of course Gil-galad, Lady Galadriel and her husband Celeborn, who rule from Lake Lenuiel at this point. I know there will be some angry law experts that will claim Celeborn was Lord of Harlingen at this point, but no, and we will get into the details in the lore breakdown. Orofeir, a subject of Galadriel and Celeborn, is also present. He is the father of Thranduil, who will also play a role in the show. Orofeir and Celeborn have a bit of history together and are friends in this series, at this point at least. There's also two unnamed elf lords who doesn't actually have any dialogue. A lord of Verlinden, the northern part of the kingdom, and a lord of Harlinden, the southern end of the kingdom. Present is also Celebrimbor, who is the head of the elven smiths in the kingdom. He is the son of Curufin and grandson of Fëanor himself, just to make that clear. Lastly, the lawmaster Pengoloth from before is also present. Círdan was of course also meant to take part in this regular council meeting, but is not present as he is escorting Aldarion to Elrond. Orofeir of course asks for him, which forces Gil-galad to tell the truth, that the Númenóreans have returned and that he has welcomed Aldarion of the blood of Elros. This makes Galadriel change the topic of the council to discussion about the allies of Lindon. I hope that the dialogue made it clear that Galadriel and Gil-galad have talked about this subject before, in the past, but that certain other elves like Orofeir haven't been part of these discussions. Gil-galad mentions that he has tried to ally with Amdi of Lórien, but that all his attempts have failed. I could go into some lore stuff here, but wait for the lore breakdown and future episodes, as we will get back to this. One important clue you should take from this though, is that the Sylvan elves prefer to have no ruler at all. These are the elves that live in Greenwood the Great, or Mirkwood, as it will be called much later. So the woodland realm doesn't exist yet, but we of course know that Orofeir will become their king and that his son Thranduil will travel with him. So expect to see more about that in a future episode. We won't actually follow them east however, as they will leave the narrative for some time and then come back in season 5. Maybe you can figure out why if you know the lore. Gil-galad ends by asking who is left. And that is actually what episode 2 is about. Potential allies of the elves. Orofeir's next line is where he questions why they are talking about finding new allies. And then Galadriel reveals that the allies and servants of Morgoth are still out there, even after he was defeated. This is the main external conflict, not just of this season, but the entire show. Of course we all know this is Sauron, but I wrote it this way as there will be more enemies than just Sauron and his subjects. And yes, it will be lore-based. And even though most of us can figure out it's probably Sauron here, there's still a tiny bit of mystery to it, unlike the Rings of Power, where it seems like the only remaining evil in all of Middle-earth. And if the audience have no knowledge about the Lord of the Rings, they might not even know about Sauron. So I think it's a fine way to handle it and still have a bit of mystery. Some of these expressions from Galadriel is actually based on some stuff she says in the Unfinished Tales, so it's not simply me making stuff up. You know, someone once said, go back to the books. Galadriel's words about the servants of Morgoth aren't that comforting to the lords, as you can imagine. And that is why Galadriel tries to downplay it by calling it mere rumors. But again, it is clearly something he has discussed before with Galadriel, so he knows it's true as well, as he also reveals to Aldarion later. Gil-galad tries to downplay the threat, as he doesn't want to cause panic, be seen as weak, or a ruler that can't handle the situation. He is the ruler over a lot of different types of elves, and it is also the differences between the elves that will play a role in future episodes. I think it's something that haven't been shown very well in neither the Rings of Power, The Hobbit, and not even in the Lord of the Rings. I hope to make it clear to the audience that elves are not simply elves. They are different from each other in many ways. They look, think, and behave differently. So expect to see some more of that. Celeborn points out that the Misty Mountains functions as a shield against enemies from the east, which is somewhat true. Celebrimbor then points out a weakness in that defense, and that is the gap south of Methedras. You need to be quite the lore expert to figure out this one. It refers to the gap of Rohan, but it can't be called that, as Rohan doesn't exist yet, nor does Calenathan. Celeborn doesn't take too kindly to Celebrimbor's remarks and tries to point out he knows nothing of military strategy. It should be clear from here that they are not on friendly terms, and in the coming episodes it will become even more clear why. Ilgalod intervenes, however, before the discussion escalates. He says that he will listen to both of them and take their words into account. Galadriel asks if the presence of the Numenorians doesn't comfort Ilgalod. And then we cut back to the scene with Círdan and Aldarion. They arrive at the house of Elrond, who is currently playing a lament of the third kinslaying. The lament itself is written by Elaran from Vinje Lampen Golmor, so thanks for helping with this. It's written in Sindarin, unlike all the other Elvish in this episode that was in Quenya. A minor lore detail is the fact that he plays a silver harp. In The Lord of the Rings, when Elrond took the White Ship to Valinor after the War of the Ring, he is said to have brought a silver harp. So this is actually meant to be that exact same harp. And as you can guess, it actually returns to that same location in a way, Grey Havens. Círdan explains to Aldarion that Elrond is a skilled loremaster and healer of Lindon. Aldarion can already feel a connection to Elrond, as he is the twin brother of Aldarion's ancestor, Elros. They don't really look alike, but Aldarion feels the kinship right away. And we will get back to this look-alike thing in a later episode, by the way. Elrond greets him and asks what name he goes by. Aldarion then replies his real name is actually Anadil, which is lore accurate. He wasn't called Aldarion at this point, but I wanted to make things a little less confusing for viewers. Elrond then asks why they've come, and Círdan says that the king sent Aldarion so Elrond could answer some of his burning questions. Círdan then leaves them and head back for the council meeting. Elrond is of course a little confused and asks what sort of questions Aldarion had in mind. Aldarion then explains that he wants to know more about the lore of Middle-earth, especially stuff that no one on Numenor seems to know. He knows that his time in Grey Havens is limited, and that in a couple of months he will return to Numenor, never to return. Elrond replies that he will do what he can to help, but that not all questions are in need of answers. This is a little nod to the lore, where we don't always have answers for everything. Aldarion then proceeds and asks Elrond what he knows about the war. This refers to the War of Wrath. It was mentioned in the prologue briefly, in case people didn't catch that. What we hear in the prologue is actually Elrond explaining some of the history of Middle-earth. It could in theory be what Elrond explains to Aldarion while we leave the scene, but it could also be something he tells him in the months Aldarion stays in Grey Havens. In any case, the prologue and narrator is not some omniscient, all-knowing storyteller, but actually Elrond trying to pass on some knowledge and lore to the Numenorian protagonist of Season 1. So in a way, Elrond also teaches us about the lore and what he knows. You can also see that as an explanation to why we don't hear everything in the prologue. Elrond simply doesn't know everything, at least not yet. We leave the scene with Aldarion and Elrond and go back to the council meeting. Gil-galad replies to Galadriel. Hope, you say. I see little hope in men. Men are weak and easily corrupted. I am afraid that the Numenorians are not as brave as their ancestors that fought beside us. Since the war, they have given up their swords, and there's not a single man among them now that has ever seen combat. The dialogue here is actually a mix of dialogue from Peter Jackson's trilogy. I see little hope in men stands in contrast to what Gandalf says to Elrond in Rivendell, and men are weak is also what Elrond replies to Gandalf. And the fact that men are easily corrupted is taken from Galadriel in the intro of the Fellowship of the Ring. I think it was a fun way to mirror and connect the stories, even though no one pointed it out in the comment section. But of course, it is also part of Gil-galad's character. And just to make it clear, there will be some sort of character development for him. His relationship to Aldarion will stand in contrast to his relationship to Elendil in Season 4 and 5. Next, Gil-galad goes on and mentions how the Numenorians no longer bear arms and have no combat experience. This is also from the lore, as I previously mentioned. It will change in this season, however. Galadriel understands men and other races in different ways than Gil-galad. She knows that time can change many things, including the Numenorians, so she advised him not to simply discard the friendship with the Numenorians. They may not be fighters now, but the ones that have arrived are skilled mariners and could be used to help in that regard, though that is not what she actually says, but that's the point of the conversation. Pengoloth joins in and points out that they are in need of allies that can fight now and not something else. So it becomes clear he takes the threat seriously, and since he is the most skilled loremaster in Middle-earth, He might know something the other elves doesn't know. Or maybe he simply believes Galadriel. Círdan arrives and joins the meeting. Right away he points out he agrees with Galadriel about the Numenorians being valuable allies despite not being skilled fighters. Again, a reference to the foresight we haven't exactly heard about yet. To this Gil-galad replies the following. I trust your wisdom, Círdan. It has never failed to prove the wisest of roads. And yet there is doubt in my heart. Men do not look beyond the years of their own time, and we do not know when this evil will strike. I am not sure if we can trust the Numenorians fully. I sense a great conflict within them. Now there is a lot to take from this, so let's go through it from the top. Gil-galad says he trusts Círdan and his advice, and that it has always proved the wisest of roads. Still, there is something inside Gil-galad that makes him doubt about the Numenorians, not Aldarion specifically, but the Numenorians in general. He points out that the men do not look beyond their own years. I think that's true even if we just look at our own world. I think it gives us some idea how the immortality of the elves makes them different from other races. My aim was to make it easier to understand why they are so isolated. Gil-galad mentions he senses a great conflict within them, which is a bit of foreshadowing of what is about to come. Aldarion was quite a great guy, but even his own daughter has a bit of a dark side. And that is also something we see in Minas Tirith that was said to have envied the immortality of the elves. This of course gets worse as time goes on, and as most of you know, if you at least know the history of Numenor, it gets pretty bad. Gil-galad continues and says, And I will not walk in the footsteps of my father and blindly trust the will of men. That is not how this kingdom will fall. Gil-galad's father is Orodreth of Nargothrond. If you have read the Silmarillion, you might have read he is the son of Fingon, but this is a mistake made by Christopher Tolkien, which he pointed out later and tried to correct. I'll have to explain this again in the lore breakdown for the die-hard fanboys of the Silmarillion, but accept it. Orodreth is the father in this show. And that is also what he is referring to here. The fact that Orodreth trusted Turin when it came to Nargothrond. He advised him to build a bridge to the stronghold, but that later led to the orcs attacking the kingdom under Glaurung. Orodreth died, Gil-galad's sister Finduilas was taken prisoner by the orcs and died. So if you try to imagine yourself being Gil-galad, it might be a little easier to understand why you wouldn't simply trust any man walking into your kingdom. As I said, Gil-galad will have some character development though, so don't expect him to remain distrustful throughout the story. To this remark, Pengoloth says that Turin isn't exactly to blame for what happened in Nargothrond, as he was cursed by Morgoth. The evil that transpired wasn't caused by him, but rather by the evil of Morgoth that followed him. There's not really a follow-up line to this, as the subject changes in the discussion, but it should be noted that Pengoloth was a lawmaster and well respected in the court. Galadriel then suggests to befriend the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, which is also what she suggests in the Unfinished Tales in one of her stories. Celeborn right away dismissed the idea and says the dwarves care for nothing but themselves. This last part is somewhat similar to what Elrond says in the film trilogy again. Same scene. Celeborn have grudges towards the dwarves, as we also learn in the Lord of the Rings. And that's due to the Battle of the Thousand Caves, fought in 503 of the First Age, fought between the dwarves of Nógrod and the elves of Melgroth. It's here where the dwarves kill King Thingol and take the Nauglamir. Celeborn was a Sindarin prince of Doriath, being the grandson of Elmo, the brother of Thingol. Thus he was the grandnephew of Thingol. It's believed that Galadriel passed over the Blue Mountains in 495, so 8 years before the battle, but it's uncertain if Celeborn went with her. But in this adaptation, he actually remained in Doriath along with his friend Oropher, who also happens to hate dwarves after the attack. So Celeborn and Oropher share history, and Throne Duel is actually also part of that. They wrongfully hate all dwarves, despite the fact it was only the dwarves from Nógrod that took part in the battle, and that the dwarves of Belegost had refused to aid them, and didn't really approve of what happened. And this actually reminded me of the sins of the father mentality. You know, where someone thinks someone else inherited the guilt, shame, or crimes of their ancestors. We see the same thing with Celebrimbor, who both of them also have a grudge against, as we are about to see in this scene as well. I think it's an interesting aspect to explore in the story, and I think some people would be quick to think of it as an allegory for the modern world. After all, there are certain people thinking that others should suffer, pay, or be ashamed that their ancestors did something, despite the fact they had nothing to do with it. I think it's fine if people interpret it like that, even though Tolkien hated allegories. I wouldn't define it as allegorical, but rather what Tolkien calls applicability, which Tolkien contrasts to allegory. And it's based on this quote by Tolkien himself. I could say more, but I think Tolkien Lore have already made an excellent video about the topic. I'll leave a link in the pinned comment below, so check it out if you want to know more about this topic. But the sins of the father mentality is actually also very biblical, and goes back to even antiquity. So in a way, it is also very Tolkienian, at least in my opinion. And it's not simply stuff I'm making up, but rather what I got out of the lore when I read through it. And I thought it would be interesting to explore this mentality in the story. Galadriel's comeback is that the dwarves would likely say the same about him. Now there are two ways to read into this. First, it can seem like a snarky comment about Celeborn as a person. Perhaps even a comment on how he doesn't seem to care about Galadriel. That's not exactly the correct interpretation though. Rather, it should be understood that the dwarves would likely say the same about the elves. So in a way, both races are prejudiced against the other. Borofir jumps in and agrees with Celeborn and alludes to the Battle of the Thousand Caves, and then he sort of blames Celebrimbor for playing a part in the second kinslaying that took place 3 years after in 506. Celebrimbor didn't actually take part in the fight however, but his father Corofin did, and it's actually during the fight Corofin died. So again, the sins of the father mentality. Celebrimbor responds that he is not his father, nor his grandfather, so he is not to blame for the things they did. In the lore, he was very much against the actions of his father and uncle, Celegorm. I think it highlights the opposite viewpoint of the sins of the father mentality, that you are not responsible for the actions of your father, brother, grandfather, or distant ancestor, for that matter. To me that makes perfect sense, but there are people out there that believe otherwise. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Borofir then questions if Celebrimbor is not to blame. This is actually a minor lore detail. The whereabouts of Celebrimbor, the late First Age, is unknown. It's quite certain he didn't fight in either of the battles. But where was he then? Did he know what his family was up to? And did he do anything to stop them? All interesting questions to ask, I think. Ilgalod intervenes and de-escalates the conflict between them. He points out that in times like these, the elves shouldn't be fighting amongst themselves. I guess you can call it a bit of foreshadowing. He gives in to Galadriel's suggestion to befriend the dwarves. He knows that he has to act, and that Galadriel will not let it slide. So even if it displeases Celeborn and Borofir, it seems like the best option for new allies. Celebrimbor then suggests to set up a colony next to Khazad-dûm, which Gil-galad questions right away. There are rumors about precious metal within Khazad-dûm. Celebrimbor have heard about it, but isn't sure what sort of precious metal it is. As head of the smiths, he knows that there are other smiths that wants to know more, so he sees it as an opportunity. Of course we can all guess it's mithril, but at least the characters don't know yet. The idea about the colony is inspired by the lore as well, though there are different accounts to why they founded Eregion. I've tried to include them all, so they all become true in a way. And that has actually been my approach to most lore elements, to try and see if elements can coexist. Gil-galad decided Celebrimbor should be the one that goes and talks to the dwarves. What we don't know is that Celebrimbor is already a bit of a dwarf friend, compared to many of the other elves at least. But we will get back to that in episode 2. Pengoloth the Lawmaster asks if he can travel with him and is granted leave. This little detail is also inspired by a note in the lore. But again, we will get back to that. Lastly, Galadriel asks what will happen if the dwarves decide not to ally them. Gil-galad responds that they better hope that the elves can handle this unknown evil on their own. We go back to Elrond and Aldarion inside the house. Elrond have just told them about the servants of Morgoth that are still out there. Elrond explains that some have fled south, others east, and some are even hiding at the roots of the earth. He assures him that the darkness of Morgoth will never last. Aldarion says that all things will come to an end sooner or later, which makes sense for mortals. But Elrond is a rather young elf, so it's a way of thinking he has not thought of before, but something he will come to realize through these 5 seasons. Aldarion thanks him and mentions that Elrond have already taught him things no one on Numenor seems to know. Elrond responds by saying the following: "May the light of Eärendil shine upon your path." Aldarion stops up and then asks for Ungoliant. Elrond replies that it's believed she either fled south or that she was killed by Morgoth and all the Balrogs. Aldarion believes she actually fled though, and to this Elrond responds the following. Worry not of such matters. Her evil is long gone from this world, a dark but fading memory of a very different time. In the next scene it's morning at the docks of Grey Havens, and Aldarion is talking to Círdan again. He is already taking notes in his book about shipbuilding. Gil-galad shows up and learns that the Numenorians will return in a couple of months, when the first leaves of autumn start to fall. It surprises him, and he asks if Aldarion can come with him to the Grey Hills. Vianto agrees, but asks them to take some of their men with them, which are the 3 companions we have already met, Ulba, Oronwe and Hendag. The scene changes to the home of Celebrimbor. Pengoloth asks why Celebrimbor is planning to head west. They are meant to go to Khazad-dûm. Celebrimbor points out that dwarves are very secretive, and will likely not simply reveal what precious metals they have found inside the mountains. So he plans to travel to Ered Luin first, and that is some of the plot in episode 2. We cut back to Aldarion, Gil-galad and the others. They arrive at the hills along with some guards to protect the High King. I know on the artworks it shows the towers, but they are not actually built yet, and it's also why they are called the Grey Hills and not the Tower Hills. It's simply a name I came up with that seems to fit the Grey Havens. And yes, the towers being built will be in one of the seasons. Maybe you can guess which one. Oronwe is in awe. The view is breathtaking, and he mentions that it is special even for Numenorian that have walked beneath the trees of Nizimaldar. We will get back to that forest in this season, by the way. They all turn around and Gil-galad shows Aldarion how vast the world of Middle-earth truly is. Again, the world is flat, so imagine they can see very far, but not that they can see everything. In the far horizon, they can see the shapes that form the misty mountains. Aldarion marvels at all the things he sees. Aldarion is no fool, however, and questions why Gil-galad brought him to the hills to show him this. Gil-galad is hesitant to reply, but gives in. He explains that there is a growing shadow out there, and that he needs Aldarion's help to find it. Aldarion is overwhelmed at first, and then starts to point out that he is likely not capable of finding it, and even if he did, what is he supposed to do? He cannot fight, nor can any of his crew. Gil-galad tries to calm him down, and mentions he could learn how to fight, but that he doesn't have to fight this unknown evil of his own. Gil-galad just wants to know where it is. Aldarion replies he cannot do it. And to this Gil-galad responds, "Fear is often our greatest enemy, but it is not fear that holds him back, but his father, Meldur. He has a duty to stay in Numenor and prepare to become the next heir. He cannot travel the world, even though he wants to." Gil-galad replies, "I see. Duty is a noble virtue to follow." That line is actually a bit of a comment about Aldarion's entire story, but again, I'll dive further into this some other time. Gil-galad says that if Aldarion changes his mind, he is always welcome in Mithrland, and that he can learn things here no one on Numenor seems to know. So he sort of uses Aldarion's own words against him. Aldarion thanks him and says that he will learn as much as he can from Gil-galad and Círdan while he stays in Mithrland. The scene ends and we cut to a minor scene inside the dining hall. Gil-galad and Aldarion talk, and it becomes clear they are on friendly terms. Vianto sits further away and observes them. He has some worries about Aldarion, but doesn't say anything. We then cut to a montage of Aldarion in Grey Havens, learning about ships and shipbuilding. He takes notes and talks with both Círdan and Gil-galad. And then to the last scene of them all. Aldarion is on board the ship and is writing in his notebook. We can see he has already taken a lot of notes. Vianto comes in and says it's about time that they return to Numenor. Aldarion refuses and says that they must tie him to the mast if he is meant to return. He knows that it is unlikely that they will ever return to Middle-earth. Whenever his father becomes king, he fears that he will never allow him to sail again. Aldarion insists and makes a speech to the crew. He talks about exploring the world of Middle-earth, new adventures, and seeing the gates of morning in the far east. There's silence for a moment as the men process the words. Vianto responds that it is a fragile dream, and this connects to what he said early on in the episode. It is one he had himself. As he said in scene 2, the sea has a way of swallowing men and their dreams. That was actually about himself. And Aldarion knows this, that deep down, Vianto doesn't want to return to Numenor. In fact, he would have sailed to many other places if he could. At last, Oronwe responds as the first, that he would go with Aldarion even to the edge of the earth. Again, keep in mind that the world is flat and not simply a figure of speech. The two other companions, Ulba and Hendrik, are the next to say that they will sail with him, and then even more of the mariners shout the same. Aldarion vows that they will return to Middle-earth whenever they can, and he even makes it a promise to Ventur. They will go back to Numenor, but not in 725. And that is where the episode ends. I hope you enjoyed this very long recap of this episode. It only felt right to explain some of the deeper stuff behind some of the words and actions of the characters. I hope you picked up on something new and found it exciting. Future episodes won't have all this exposition, that will be in the lore breakdowns, so fear not. And speaking of the lore breakdown, it will be the next video to come out. It's rather long though, so it might take a little before it's ready. After that, episode 2. While we wait for that, feel free to check out one of these videos next. As always, thank you all for watching. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Farewell till next time.